Good morning and happy Sabbath. We are so glad that you have chosen to join us this morning, like every Sabbath morning. If this is your first time here, we just want to say welcome, and we hope that this is a blessing for you. We've been studying the book of Psalms together, and today I'm so excited for us to lead through or dive through the discussion of how God arises and stands up for those who are oppressed, those who are in need, and those who are poor. But before we dive into the passage, let's offer a word of prayer to our God. Our good and gracious God, we invite you into this space to guide us, to help us to understand, help us to learn. These words that you inspired so many years before, let these words also be a transforming element in our lives today is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So today I am joined by Jesse, one of our team members who primarily serves in the Anthem community, but also helps us guide that community towards that vision of discipleship, growing disciples in our church. So Jesse, so glad to have you here today. How are you doing?
Glad to be here. Good.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, we were just talking about pets a little bit off screen before, and you have two dogs?
Yeah, two.
Two dogs. And how has that journey been with your pets? And
it's funny. We had a corgi first, and then we got another dog who's more full size to be the corgi's play partner. And the corgi played very rough when the other dog was a puppy, and then that dog grew and grew and grew, and now the corgi's like, what in the world? I don't really want to be attacked all the time by a much bigger dog. So that's been the journey there.
That's hard. And then somewhere in there, you start having kids too.
Yeah, no, we have two. So
yeah.
2 and 2.
Wow. That's a lot. It's a busy, full household.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
When we had the pets, it was like, it felt like a lot. And then we had the kids and like, why did we have the pets? It's already too much of the kids. So,
so overwhelming. Yeah. Well, we're glad you're here today. We've just went through a incredible rainstorm this past week here in Southern California. If you are not from Southern California, there was this atmospheric river, is that what they called it? And just historic rainfall here. And where you guys are living?
I'm from Washington State, so that was normal. I was like, oh, this is like a normal month. But yeah, where we were living, we didn't have any issues or anything like that. Just a lot of rain. So.
Yeah, I know in certain parts of Southern California, there was mudslides and flooding and stuff like that. But here in Loma Linda area, it hasn't been too bad.
No, thankfully.
Thankfully. Yeah. So we've been studying through the book of Psalms throughout this quarter. And today we're going to be in a number of different Psalms, but they seem to have this common theme about God as being a warrior, God as being this powerful being who stands up for those who are oppressed. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to ask you about that imagery. When you think of God, is that the image that you have in your mind of God as a warrior, as God as a one who enacts vengeance on people? Like, how does that connect with your image of who God is?
I mean, it didn't used to be. That used to be a very foreign concept for me. Growing up in the church, you read your Bible and there's a lot of that sort of imagery.
Yeah.
And it's like, what? I don't relate to this at all.
Yeah.
The stuff that you tend to relate to, at least that I did, was more of the like emotionally present sort of God and God of love, a God of compassion, those types of things.
Yeah.
I think as I've gotten older, the idea of a God who fights on behalf of people, but especially those who don't have others to fight for them, that's become more and more compelling, I think, both for myself, but especially for those who just don't have anyone to advocate for them. And you see that in the world, and then you think of a God that would raise their cries above all the others to a large degree. It's like, wow, that's a God that is just very opposite to how we would view power in this world, because a lot of the power structures in our world always cater. And I think there's just something about it that makes sense. They cater to the people who also have power.
Yeah.
And so those who don't have power, there's not much to gain from them.
Yeah.
And so a God that has everything does not seek to gain more, but instead gives his voice to those who don't have a voice. Like, that's just a very upside down concept. So I think that has become a lot more attractive to me. And then a God who would fight, I think that has been something that over the last few years I've become more aware of it being more attractive to me. In certain contexts. So that's kind of, I guess, my feeling about that. I don't know if your journey has been the same or not.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to, I love that, what you said. That's fascinating, that God is a powerful God, but he uses his power for those who are powerless.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of times people who are powerful in our world often use their power and their influence to help either themselves or other people who are powerful who can help them later on.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's nothing to gain. It feels like there's nothing to gain for helping those who are powerless.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think in our current climate, there is a little bit of that where you can gain status if you focus on certain social issues.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting thing to add to the equation, because now it isn't just altruistic. It isn't just purely out of love all the time. Sometimes it's out of, I will gain status and acceptance and notoriety from a certain crowd if I voice my support of the downtrodden or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's been an interesting thing, but God seems to stand up for it when there is no benefit to him. Technically, there is no what's the right word? There's no, that thing to be gained, I guess, is really what it is, which is really crazy to think of that, because almost all the other gods in more pagan stories or literature are gods that tend to be a lot more, what can I gain from these ants that, like, humans, but they're kind of viewed as ants. And that's oversimplification, I think, of all the stories, but there's a lot more of that. And then in the Bible, there's a God who humanizes everybody and draws up those who are human and made in his image, but not being treated well by others. Like it's just so upside down. I mean, it's really crazy.
It really is. Yeah. Like God took care of those in need before it was cool to do so.
Yeah.
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 And in our society, you sometimes wonder, are people doing this because they want the attention, they want the notoriety, or are they doing this because they really genuinely care for others?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a really weird spot to be in, because there has been, I think back to 2020 and a lot of these social justice issues that got brought up. And I think of the deep necessity of a lot of that. And then also the really interesting sort of odd stuff that also got added to it. Yeah. And so, when you have people who are fighting on behalf of the downtrodden, but going so far as to almost ignore them. It's almost becomes a personal crusade rather than actually being for.
Wow.
Now, that wasn't everybody.
Yeah.
There was a certain segment. And I just think of that as like, God just has, at least from what I see, he just has this unending desire for justice. It's like that whole idea of let justice roll down. Yeah. Just justice to happen. And it doesn't matter of whether it benefits, of who it benefits specifically. I guess what I mean by that is it doesn't matter if it benefits those who God has favored or if it benefits those he doesn't. I mean, you go back to Joshua and God shows up, Joshua's there, and God says, and Joshua's like, who are you? Are you for us or are you for our enemies? And the angel of the Lord or God in that moment just says, no. But as command, it's like God has a different agenda than us. Yeah. And his agenda is completely separate from our agendas, which is so interesting. Yeah. And also very challenging. So
yeah, he doesn't draw the lines the way that we draw the lines and say this is us versus them. Yeah. His agenda is more, you are all actually my people. Yeah. And really the people I will speak up most for are those who can't speak up for themselves. Yeah.
Super interesting.
Yeah. So let's get into this passage. It's Psalm 18 is the first one we wanted to take a look at. And of all the Psalms, because there were a number of different Psalms in this lesson, the reason why this was so compelling for me is there's such unique imagery here, imagery that I don't necessarily, like you asked the question, how does this align with my vision of God? it doesn't necessarily align with my vision of who God is. And so I actually like those kind of instances that irk me and challenge me to expand my view of who God is, because I may be trying to pigeonhole God a little bit.
Sure.
And this is definitely one of those passages. So let's take a look. It's Psalm chapter 18, verses 3 through 18. I don't know, Jesse, would you read part of it for us?
Sure.
Like
3
through 10?
Yeah. I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I was delivered from my enemies. The waves of death engulfed me. The currents of chaos overwhelmed me. The ropes of Sheol tightened around me. The snares of death trapped me. And in my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried out to my God. From his heavenly temple, he heard my voice. He listened to my cry for help. The earth heaved and it shook. The roots of the mountains trembled. They heaved because he was angry. Smoke ascended from his nose. Fire devoured as it came from his mouth. He hurled down fiery coals. He made the sky sink as he descended. A thick cloud was under his feet. He mounted a winged angel and flew. He glided on the wings of the wind.
He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced with hailstones and bolts of lightning. The Lord thundered from heaven. The voice of the Most High resounded. He shot his arrows and scattered the enemy. With great bolts of lightning, he routed them. The valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare. At your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of your nostrils, blast of the breath from your nostrils, he reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of the deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. Wow. Okay. So when we read through this, what stands out to you about this passage? What challenges you? What questions do you have? What inspires you?
Yeah.
Like, what stands out to you in this passage?
I think the parts that get me, because this is poetry, and so it's pulling out these metaphors and word pictures that I think they do something emotionally, internally, that you can kind of, it isn't just like he's making an argument. He's just like, this is some imagery that I'm bringing out. And the part that got me was smoke ascended from his nose, fire devoured as it came from his mouth. He hurled down fiery coals. He made the sky sink as he descended.
Yeah.
And a thick cloud was under his feet. And then you have like this whole imagery of like these clouds going in front of him.
Yeah.
And then like literally the sea just gets like I guess if you imagine blowing on a really shallow piece of water and it kind of separates, but imagine that with the sea.
Yeah.
And so you could see the bottom of it, and then David being taken out of the raging waters. And I guess all of that just gets me, like, there's this emotional connection to that I think is like both terrified and also the whole point of God doing that in this poem is to take David out of the chaotic waters.
Yeah.
Which, at least to me, kind of goes back to flood imagery, goes back to like Genesis 1:1 or 1:2, where it's like the earth is formless and void, just water covers the surface of the earth. And then God creates out of that. And then you get the flood where everything crashes back. It's like the uncreation of the waters covering the earth again. Yeah. And it's almost like David feels like he's in the chaos and it feels like the earth is falling apart. My life is falling apart. Everything is coming. And God does all of this in his glory to then come and pull me out of that. That's pretty wild. Like, that's pretty crazy wild imagery. So,
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you make a great point and we talked about this a little bit last week as well, Miguel and I, that the first thing that we have to keep in mind as we read the Psalms is that it is poetry, right? So it's not really meant to be taken literally. It's not like God actually literally did these things for David. Yeah. But that poetry, because it's poetry, I think you made a great point. The idea is those images are supposed to evoke an emotion, right? That's really what's behind poetry. Yes, there's some information that's being passed, but mostly it's supposed to be emotive. Like songs are emotive. Yeah. Poetry is emotive. And You said that as you picture this, when we picture this in our mind's eye with like the thunder and lightning and hail and God coming and rescuing, like even the distress, the cords of death entangled me, you're right? The cords of grave coiled around. I almost imagine almost like a snake, like wrapping around and dragging him down, and he's like desperate. That like one of my greatest fears is to be buried alive.
Oh yeah. 100%.
Like that thought of just, I mean, it's a lack of control. It's like desperation, just slowly suffocating to death. And I can't even imagine the feeling of being wrapped around and slowly being dragged under. Oh, that would be terrifying, right?
Yeah.
So that emotion you said, that evoked terror, right?
Well, it's even like the idea of Sheol is the underworld.
Yeah.
And if it's my understanding is correct, that a lot of that is the depths of the sea were a bit terrifying because you couldn't see them. Like, and even now that we can see them with like submersibles and stuff, it's still terrifying.
It's still terrifying.
And so Sheol kind of exists. So it going back to that chaotic waters, like it's like he's being wrapped and then pulled down into the waters. And either David's being very dramatic, or this is what he's experiencing emotionally, the distress, like you're bringing out. And then all the imagery of God showing up is like, that's deliverance. In a way. Yeah.
So what imagery does that, what emotion does that imagery? Like you're you're desperate, you're terrified, you have no control. And then God shows up with, smoke rising from his nostrils, consuming fire coming from his mouth, burning coals blazing out of it. Like what imagery is that supposed to evoke, or what emotion is that supposed to evoke?
I mean, at least for me, what it feels like is the overwhelming power of God on display. And I don't mean that like in a sterile way. I mean, there's a genuine terror that comes from that because I am a finite human. And this is just David's imagery of how it feels, how he feels, almost like in the chaos of his life, God is showing up.
Yeah.
But it's not like he's actually experiencing these images, but it's the closest thing he can get to internal, like to explain what's happening internally or what's happening in his life around him. And if that's the case, then David is sitting there saying, God is this powerful.
Yeah. And
that terror is both, I think, a good terror because it puts us in our rightful place. We're not God. We're not what the Genesis 3 fall narrative tells us that we thought we could be. Like, we're not God. And so that terror almost is like, okay, rightfully so. I don't have any of that capability that David is laying out here. But there's also a comfort in it because that imagery of this terrifyingly powerful God, like literally, it's like the sky just like bows underneath him.
Yeah.
And then he comes down, the sea moves, and then all of that power directed at the rescue of David. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so, but if we're going to get into literally the imagery, the more scary imagery, I guess I would call it, that is either just terrifying because we don't want to admit that God is that much greater than us, or it's a little bit of that, rightfully so, and it could be this deep acceptance that the God who is that powerful is not using that power to come destroy me, but to rescue. That's his first heart is to rescue me. And we can talk about when we are the people who are doing injustice, there's a rightful fear that comes from because God is not about the injustice that we're doing. He's trying to stop that. So there's dichotomy there. But when you are the focus of rescue, you want a God that is this powerful showing up. You don't want a God who's like, put his arms around you like, hey, I'm really sorry, but sorry, I can't do anything about it. It's like, you don't really want that. You want a God who can act and do something. And so that's kind of the imagery. That's what the imagery says to me.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I love the dichotomy that you're setting up, that God just in the imagery itself is terrifying, right? It's rightly terrifying, but you kind of want a terrifying God when he has your back, right?
Yeah,
when he's the one that rescues you.
You want your linebacker showing up, not your like rocket scientist in certain situations, it's like you need both, but you want the bigger guy when there's something terrifying facing you. And so, you could, if you were to describe your linebacker looking uncle in a way that would come across as very terrifying.
Yeah.
But what it means for you is safety.
Yeah.
Which is pretty powerful. So
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, on behalf of all rocket scientists out there, I take a little bit of offense that rocket scientists can't be terrifying like a linebacker.
They're terrifying in different contexts.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of the story that John Ortberg tells of how he was walking down like some beach town one day with his friends, and then he saw like a bar brawl happen right in front of him, like people like coming out, like rolling out, and like a gang of guys beating up on one guy, and he felt the need to stand up and like speak up and stop it, right? Like defend this one guy that's just being ganged up on. But you know, he's a pastor, he's not particularly skilled at fighting, but he speaks up anyway. And then these guys like advance at him, and then they all of a sudden they stop, they get scared. And he's like, oh, what's going on? Like, why are they scared of me? And then he looks back and he sees his like 6'6", 250-pound linebacker of a friend that he says that they call Mongo, but never to his face. Like standing there. And then all of a sudden he's like, yeah, that's right. He's with me. And in those moments, you need that, right? Like you want that. You want that kind of God. You want that kind of backup.
Yeah. Because I think like the God that a lot of us have come to know in what is a really healthy, I think, pursuit of knowing God is a God that is deeply emotionally good and present. But to some degree that can be impotence. Yeah. It can be, wow, thanks so much for I love you so much. Thanks so much for being part of my life. And it's like, that's good. You need that kind of father, but you also need a father who, when someone is bullying you, when something is going wrong, will show up and act on your behalf in ways that aren't always like whitewashed and nice. Yeah. Sometimes you need a father to put a stop to something that's negative. And when you think of what could really be happening around people and the deep injustice that can happen in this world, like if someone is abusing, let's say there's a wife who's being abused, we all we want the movie scene where like a friend of her, like her wife's husband, or her friend's wife's friend's husband shows up, and he's this big dude and comes in and like makes the abusive husband cower. Yeah. You want that because there's something that feels just about it. Yeah. And so we can argue about exactly how God does that, but that's the imagery that David seems to be deeply intimate with. Yeah. He's not afraid of a God who's going to show up like that. In fact, he calls on that God. Yeah. But then he also calls on a God who is forgiving and merciful and compassionate and slow to anger and all those things. So he can see both. Yeah. Which is pretty cool. Yeah, those are both parts of who God is. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's part of the answer to the question I'm going to ask next. But like one of the imageries the imagery of God that the psalm has that challenged me the most was verse 11. And I'm not sure why this stuck out to me so much, but he made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. And I don't know, it's just that mindset that God, the imagery around God is usually always light, right? Yeah. And here it's like darkness. Yeah. That's his covering. And that just, I don't know, that irked me, and that bothered me a little bit, that darkness would be what God would come with, right? And yet, like you said, darkness isn't his only characteristic, but it does challenge me a little bit that's the way. And again, this is not God literally coming with darkness, but this is the way that David is describing the coming of God. I think the sense I get from that is that he's coming like a storm. I think that's sort of the imagery. That's
on the definitely
wings of the wind, shrouded in darkness, thick rain clouds, and then from the brightness in front of him, which is then pretty interesting. Isn't that interesting? That's super. I don't exactly know what he's calling on there, but it does seem like there's a storm imagery to it, as well as something else from the brightness in front of him. And so that is also a powerful thing, because I think, especially if you think with all the modern technology that we have, storms are still terrifying because we can't really control them. Yeah. I mean, like if you think what hurricanes can do, you can create dikes and dams and all sorts of things to protect, cities from all of the power of a storm, and they can still be overcome.
Yeah.
There's something inherently in us that we're just like, that's uncontrollable, and I think that's maybe some of the imagery is calling on.
Yeah.
That is like, I can't touch that.
Yeah.
Whatever force that is coming to rescue me, I actually can't. I have zero power in it, and so as I'm processing through that, that's kind of what comes to mind for me.
Yeah. That reminds me of the story of the king who was walking on the beach, again on the beach with his advisors, and the king is trying to get some advice about something, and the advisors say, "Oh, king, you can do anything. Like you can whatever you decide will be right because you can do anything." And so then the king walks up to the ocean and he stands in the midst of the waves and says, "Stop." And obviously the waves don't stop, and they're like, "King, what are you doing? You're getting wet." And he's like, "Don't tell me that I can do anything because obviously the waves don't obey me." Yeah. And yet we serve a God.
That's where it gets terrifying.
Yeah.
Because you're like, oh, shoot, I can't do anything about whatever God chooses to do.
Yeah.
I don't have power against or for. Like, I'm at the mercy of whatever that God's character is, which is pretty wild. Yeah. And so that's right. Just what you were saying, that kind of gave me chills as I was thinking of the imagery that David brings out. And what you were saying. And
no wonder the disciples were a little bit afraid of Jesus when Jesus was able to calm the storm. Like, who is this guy, right? That you can tell the winds and the waves to stop and they obey you, right? That's just, that's amazing. It's incredible.
Well, and I think of a lot of the imagery that would have been familiar to people in this world, especially when you think of all the pantheons of gods that existed. You had storm gods. You had, you had all of these different types of gods that had different roles. And so I think that's also a little bit of imagery that we might miss out on, not because David is comparing and saying God is like this other God, but just it's very familiar imagery that these certain, what we would call natural events, storms or earthquakes or things like that, that's all the act of a God is sort of intuitive to their worldview. And so when he brings like the storm imagery out, or when he brings like this almost animalistic smoke ascended from and fire devoured, all that stuff would have been way more familiar as like expressions of power. Yeah. That maybe we kind of miss out on because of that. But it is definitely foreign, like you said, like the darkness or these different things. Like, that's weird. Yeah. But yeah.
And this actually, as you were talking, it kind of struck me. I wonder if that is why humans felt the need to ascribe all of these forces to being controlled by gods or being
deify them.
Yeah, because when it's just uncontrolled and wild and there's no rational explanation for what happens, we feel powerless. Yeah. But ascribing it to a God that we can somehow appease with our sacrifices or something gives us some measure of control.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is really crazy about a lot of how God is portrayed, is that he isn't controllable, but his character is what makes him trustworthy. Yeah. And that's such a different perspective to me, because a lot of the gods, and again, I am oversimplifying. I think if you get deep into the ancient Near East, like culture and stuff, or like stories about their gods and stuff, there's nuance there, but a lot of it is sort of a very human way of interacting with each other. They just happen to be more powerful. Yeah. But the thing that I think we see here is there's this God we literally cannot control, and yet his character is good. Yeah. And so he is both terrifying and deeply comforting. Yeah. All at the same time, and especially when he's on your side. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a way of like you've appeased him or anything, but it just, I guess almost the way that I would look at it is that God cares about what is true because he made the world. He knows how it works, how it best functions, how we best function in relationships as individuals, as whole communities and all of that stuff. So he's fighting for what is good. And when we align with his vision for it, then he is absolutely, that is his agenda, is for our flourishing. But then when you get into like the injustice side, that is where God is against it. And that's terrifying. But at the same time, you want the God who's going to come in and fight on behalf of those who are being unjustly hurt or oppressed, because it is the opposite of what is good for humanity. And if humans aren't going to do anything about it, then you want a God who's going to step in and do something. And the imagery here is powerful because it means that the God that's stepping in is like, no, guys, stop. It's like, if he chooses to step in, if he chooses to do something about it, it will not be controlled by us. And there's something both terrifying and also deeply comforting
about that.
Yeah.
So. That's I love the contrast that you set up there between the ancient Near Eastern gods of who were powerful but just as bad as humans, versus God who is powerful, all powerful, but is better than humans. Yeah.
Better than we could possibly desire. And there's definitely some questionable things that we struggle with. Like, was that God doing it? Was that humans ascribing him to him the responsibility for doing it?
Yeah.
But scholars still have questions about that. But at least when we look at the whole arc of Scripture, I definitely see that this God is better than we could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And that's good when you don't have any control over that God. So yeah.
But with God, behaving this way, at least with David picturing God to behave this way against his enemies. And in the inscription, it talks about how Saul was the enemy, right? The enemies that were chasing him was like Saul. So with him describing God coming at his enemies this way, how does that connect with like what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, where he says, or 43 and 44, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. So then how does that work with God telling us, Jesus telling us, love our enemies, and yet in this imagery, it's like God raining vengeance down on our enemies?
I think, like, if you think about what's going on in David's life, I mean, he hasn't done anything wrong, and now he has this king who's chasing him around because the king is jealous.
Yeah.
And when you look at least contextually for me, I look back at the story of Saul, and you have to do a lot of sitting with it because it's not immediately clear.
Yeah.
But as you go through the story, he does all of these things that are him taking control of his kingdom instead of letting God be in control.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, when God says, I'm going to take this kingdom away from you, he does, instead of turning around and being like, I've really messed up here, I need to shift and turn around, he instead goes full bore down the paranoid, concerned about who's going to take his kingdom away from him. Like, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yes.
And so that's why he's chasing David around, because David's this rising star and Saul's concerned.
Yeah.
And so if you're in David's shoes, you're like, this is not okay. Like, I haven't done anything. I've been faithful, if anything, overwhelmingly faithful to this king. And yet I'm getting this response. And so I think there's definitely the injustice experience that David has of, this is not okay. Is someone going to do something about it? And if God has anointed that king, and if God has now apparently anointed him to be David now to be king, then God, it's in your hand. You got to figure this out. And I think that's a big piece of it too, that David did not mistreat Saul even when he had him in his hands to be able to do so. Like the two moments in caves where he could have killed him. He doesn't. He says, I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. And then later, when people do come to David after Saul has been killed and said, we got him, David has them executed, because how dare you take control over what God would do? Yeah. And that's a really crazy way of looking at it. So you could say that, I can't say for certain where David's heart is, but there is a hinting at the fact that David does not hate Saul, but he certainly is not stoked about he's not happy about the situation that he's in. It feels unjust. It feels unfair. And so it seems like he's calling on the God who is the arbitrator of justice. This is his kingdom. Like, literally, his kingdom on earth is the Jewish nation at that time. You do something about this. Yeah. And then he's envisioning this God who is powerful beyond measure to act on his behalf. But also, I don't think that he was sitting there like, you need to destroy my enemy by literally, you need to do this all for me. It's just like, God, this feels unjust. I'm asking you to be God and to do something here. And that's kind of my impression of where he's at. Yeah.
That is so powerful. And I love the dynamic, how you point out the dynamic between David and Saul, because even though he's like writing this psalm and praying this prayer, by his actions shows that he does care for Saul,
Yeah.
and that he is going out of his way to try to protect Saul, who is the Lord's anointed, right? So it does show that David, regardless of what he's praying here, he's living out the principles of love your enemy.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So he's actually doing that, even though he's praying for God to step in.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful too, because like you said, David was a warrior. He had many opportunities to take vengeance himself, to take justice into his own hands. And instead, he chooses to pray instead.
Yeah.
Right? And say, God, you make this right.
And ask,
right? Praise and prayer are the tools that this warrior David uses when he had at his disposal like swords and arrows and warriors who would fight alongside him to take the throne for himself. And he chooses not to do that. Yeah.
I think it's moments like that I think that's the reason that we call David a man after God's own heart. There's consistent moments. I mean, you could look at the big failure moments. He has those.
He definitely does.
But if you even look at his responses to those moments, I don't think God ever once is, what's the right word? Enabling his actions. I don't think God is just like, oh, that's fine. I mean, God obviously cares deeply about the injustice that David did. But there's a response that David consistently has that I think is the reason that he's called a man after God's own heart. And I think that is mainly that when things are difficult, he does not tend to go the route of self-trust. He goes right back to the God who is the king of his kingdom and says, I trust you, whether that's in this, like Saul is literally unjustly oppressing me, and I'm going to the God who is my protector, or even in the aftermath of his sin, I have obviously gotten this wrong, and I'm coming back to you, and I'm begging for certain outcomes, but you're God and I trust you. And then even later when his son rebels against him, they bring the Ark of the Covenant to go with him. And he's like, no, leave that here. If God brings me back to it, then that's his prerogative, which is crazy. Because he's not claiming God is going with him. He's saying if God is God, he'll bring me back if he so chooses. And if he doesn't, then that's his will. And you're like, there's something about that that's pretty crazy. And that he seems to have a healthy balance of a God who both fights against injustice, whether that's him, David, or those who are oppressing him, and then the God who, that's like the soldier God, the fighting God, and there's the God who's deeply present personally. That's a pretty healthy balance of those perspectives, and that's why I think it seems like he's writing this from that healthy tension of the two.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why David is one of my favorite characters in the Bible, because he seems so real, right? Like he messes up bad, like really bad at times. And yet he never messes up in that he doesn't return back to God, right? Like even when he messes up, even when he trusts himself more than God, eventually he comes to the place and realizing, no, this is not going to work. I've got to rely on God. God has, and that becomes his default. When the chips are down, he makes sure that he's going back to God and trusting God. And that's a powerful thing, I think, that this passage points out, and that the theology of God that we see throughout Scripture seems to point out, is that God does take vengeance. I mean, God says, vengeance is mine. He literally says, vengeance is mine, right? But I wonder if what God is saying to us is that you humans are not capable of handling vengeance. Like, because of sin, because of our brokenness, because we are not like God, our character is not like his, we don't do vengeance well.
No, we tend not to.
Which is why, when in Deuteronomy it talks about an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. What he's saying is, you used to take, if someone took your eye, you took their life, right? He's trying to restrict the vengeance here.
At least just make it proportional.
Exactly. But I think what God is showing is that he's the only one capable of doing vengeance well. So trust vengeance to him. And if you're in those spaces where things are unjust and it seems like the cords of death are wrapping around you and pulling you down, it's praise and prayer that's the answer. It's not power and violence that will get you out.
Because those things will get you out in the short term, but you'll either you live by the sword, you die by the sword kind of thing, or you will will become the very thing that was oppressing you.
Mm.
And that's sort of the cycle of humanity, which is
Yeah.
why I think that's why God chooses the Israelites and is faithful, overwhelmingly faithful to them consistently, but then calls them out. I mean, the prophets are all just, you have either started worshiping these other gods who are not me,
Yeah.
or it's you have oppressed the poor and the widow and the sojourner among you.
Yeah.
It's those two reasons that they're being called out consistently.
Yeah.
And you would say, well, wait, if God is on their side, you would expect this God to just, I'm for you no matter what. And I think the best analogy that I can come to is just the parental analogy, that there is a righteous indignation and anger that comes from a parent when their own child has done something that has harmed others or harmed the family or harmed even that own child themselves.
Yeah.
You want a parent who will have that anger at something, because if they don't, then it's not wrong.
Mm.
It's fine. Like, don't worry about it. I guess, like, yeah, you bullied that person, but as long as you didn't get caught.
Yeah.
That we kind of intuitively know this is not good for the world. It's not good for me or for us or for other people. And so if someone condones that, something feels off about that.
Yeah.
It works for me in the short term, but it doesn't work over the long term. There's always negative consequences associated with that. So you want a God who's standing up for what is actually genuinely good.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want a parent like that. And so that for me, that's why I've become far more okay and like good with that idea that God would be a warrior, because there is, or just angry at things that are unjust, because there is some part of me that wants a parent who will say, what you have done is not okay to me.
Yeah.
That's never comfortable, but you want that because it gives you good direction for how to align with what is truly good in the world, as opposed to what you are trying to make good, even though it isn't. But then you also want that same God who, when you are in positions of being oppressed, who will say, it's not okay that this is happening to you, and I'm fighting on your behalf in ways that you don't always understand, but I am doing that. And ultimately, if you don't adopt all of the ways that everybody else is oppressing you, I'm fighting on your behalf. You don't have to pick up all those tools and fight their way. I'm fighting for you. I want a God like that.
Yeah.
Even if I don't always want it in the short term, when you zoom out, I'm like, I want that God.
Yeah.
Not the God I might create.
Because the reality is, love is not permissive, right?
Yeah.
It means love doesn't mean that there's no rules,
Yeah.
right? Boundaries are healthy.
Yeah.
Accountability is important,
Yeah.
right? And we need a God. We need a father, a parent who will establish boundaries and hold us accountable, right? Otherwise, we've seen what happens when everything is just permissive, and it's not healthy. It's destructive, right? And that was like Satan's way, and God he's very clearly shown that way does not work, right? And so we want a God, we need a God who will establish those boundaries and say, this is right, this is wrong, and I will stand for what is right.
Yeah. And act like very intentionally on the behalf of people who are being oppressed by people who are twisting the fabric of reality to their own benefit. Yeah. And that's really like that's where you look at Saul, who he's trying to twist what is supposed to be a really good relationship between the king of all things and his people on this earth. And he's twisting that and saying, this is my thing. I'm going to hold tight to it at all costs. And even if I have to destroy those who have done nothing wrong to me because of, but simply because of my own perceptions about what they're doing, I will do what I feel is right. Yeah. And David's on the receiving end of that. And I think we end up in those spaces, whether it's like parental relationships, or even like sibling relationships as you get older, or friends or coworkers or bosses or whatever. You might end up in this space where like what is happening to me feels unjust. And the fact that there is a God who says what that person is doing by twisting all of this to their own benefit, it's not good. And I'm on your side in this. Yeah. But he's also like, don't start doing that yourself to get back at them. Like the whole vengeance is mine. Don't start doing that, because as soon as you do that, it's not that I don't love you, but I have the same heart that I have for that person who's doing that to you. I have that same heart for the things that you might do that's like them. And that's a tough one for us to sit in because we just want God to be on our side.
Yeah.
I think. And so, I don't know. That's just kind of, that is something that has been, when I was younger, I didn't like that idea.
Yeah.
And now that I get older, I'm like, I don't always love it, but I big picture want that.
Yeah, we want to be God's favorite.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
There's something in us that says, oh yeah. And it's true, God is for us no matter what. Like no matter what we do, God loves us and he's for us and he's trying to rescue us. But that doesn't mean that he's going to stand up for all the terrible things that we do. And when we cross into those lines where we're the oppressor, and that's the other part of this lesson, right? In Psalm 82, it talks about how God feels towards those who are doing the oppressing and how God responds. And this is something that I think all of us need to be careful of. Psalm 82, it says, God presides in the great assembly. He gives judgment among the gods. And gods here are in quote, because the lesson notes that it's not talking about ancient gods or true gods. It's people who put themselves in place of God as it's giving judgment to others. And then it asks the question, how long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? So it's asking those gods, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. So it's talking to people, right? But you will die like mere mortals. You will fall like every other ruler. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the inheritance are all of the nations are your inheritance. So it bookends this psalm in the fact that God is the ultimate judge. But we who sometimes sit in judgment of others or who have a power or authority to do good or to do evil, and we choose to oppress those who don't have power and take advantage of our position. This is saying, you're under judgment of the ultimate judge, God.
Yeah. You can't claim to be above this because this is, it's wild because God, this is an outflow of God. Justice and righteousness and goodness is an outflow of him. And he's like, if you try and claim that you are above that, it's like you're trying to claim that you're above the creator. And you may not be thinking that way, but that's sort of like when you zoom out, that's what you're trying to do is say, I know how to do this better, at least for my benefit. And God's like, no, you will die like a mortal. You think that you are, to some degree, you almost are taking on this idea of like, I can't be controlled. I am the ultimate decision-making authority in my life. And God's like, you're not. You're just not. What I care about is far more true than what you're caring about. And when you align with what I care about, you will see the goodness in this world, and you will do justice, and you will love mercy, and you will walk humbly with me. But when you do the opposite, it leads to all sorts of destruction, not just for others, but also for you. And I think that's a bit terrifying.
Yeah.
But also it's good.
Yeah, it's good. Because in this world, we often think of the more power we have, the less accountability we need to keep. But what God is saying here is actually the more power you have, the more I'm going to hold you accountable for that power. And that is a scary, but it is a good thing too, that God holds those who have power and authority accountable.
Yes.
And if in any of our spaces, whether we have power over our children or power over influencing things in the church or out in the world as bosses, or it's an important reminder that we should be using that power wisely and justly the way that God would.
Because we can create spaces that are unjust in ways that are so small and subtle. I think of like parenting. There's so many things that we can do over time that seem like nothing. But if I don't listen to my kids, if I haven't let them have like a say in their life and in the world and in how I treat them, even at some point, if I don't let them do that, that is an injustice that they'll carry with them for the rest of their life and might have to fight against and might bring into the world. So it's like the small injustice that I have done. And so that's where it's like God is saying, I hold any of you who have power. And you can say, well, I don't have that much power. Well, that's the thing, is that I have way more power than I think I do. And then that's where God is also like, and I want you, I'm on your side. I want good things, but also there is an accountability and a care that I have for doing what is good, because it won't just impact that individual, it will impact all the people that they interact with. We're all connected. I mean, that's why God cares about it so much. It isn't just about me. It's about just this whole system of humanity that exists. And so I'm glad he cares about it.
Yeah. And he holds us accountable.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Will you pray for us as
Yeah, for sure. God, thank you so much for being the God that you are. It is a little bit terrifying to be on the other end of your power and your glory and your unyielding commitment to goodness. So often we are both the victim and the perpetrator of injustice in this world. And somehow you hold that all in tension as well. So while we are a little bit terrified and scared of being on that other side of your justice and your goodness, we also are deeply held within your arms as a father holds a child and loves them even in the mistakes and even in the getting it wrong. So just thank you for being a God that can hold all of that in tension and can be as good as you are. Thank you in your name. Amen.
Amen. So friends, remember, if you are struggling and you feel like you're being oppressed or dragged down by chains to Sheol, remember that you have a powerfully just God who stands for you. And if you have power and you have authority, remember also that you have a powerfully just God who stands for everyone. Have a wonderful Sabbath.